Hello, everyone. This is Ruth Hoyt with the May 20th TexNEP meeting. And we've got a wonderful guest tonight. Her name is Shari Hunt. I've been following her on Instagram and seen programs by her through Linda Nichols' Happiness Hour program. And so thanks to Linda, I've met Shari through Zoom and hope to meet her someday in person. I'd love to do a workshop with you. Anyway, Shari, I'll let you continue and introduce yourself and talk about what you're going to talk about tonight.
Okay, sure. So before I start the presentation, I'll just kind of introduce who I am. I don't do photography full time. This is my hobby. But I've always had a camera in my hand. I've always been interested in nature, environment, and landscapes. And probably not until maybe 2010 did I accidentally do like a long exposure of the sky. I literally was putting my really good manual camera down on the driveway and decided to just, I didn't even have a tripod. I just literally put it on 30 seconds, put it down, pushed go, and I just wanted to see what it would do. And I was amazed by all the blurry stars. So I kind of went from there, and I got really into long exposure photography and night photography. And I didn't jump into it right away because we didn't really have a lot of good great cameras at the time, or I didn't anyway, to really get into it. But I probably got more into sky photography and night sky photography about, 6-7 years ago. So, but like I said, I work full time. I actually am involved with medical research, and I'm a training manager. So I train trainers how to train, and I teach people adult learning theory and training components in compliance part of medical research. So I'm always training, and I'm always making curriculum. And I started enjoying night photography so much that I did start having a lot of free meetups, and I got so spoiled by the skies in Big Bend and how dark they are that I always went to Big Bend. And there's probably some decent darker skies than Dallas Fort Worth within 3 miles, but anytime I was going to go shoot skies, I would just go to Big Bend, which for me is a 9-hour drive. And I just got so used to it, and I invited people to come with me, but the groups that I had got bigger and bigger, and I had to kind of, moderate them a little bit and narrow them down. So I started just actually having workshops and formal workshops. So right now I do workshops in Big Bend and Mount Rainier. I used to live in Seattle for about 12 years, and so I'm very familiar with Mount Rainier. Those are my two places I love to do night photography and teach people. And I think for me, seeing that aha moment, seeing people learn how to do this the first time or get better at it and get some tips or tricks on how to get better is just, that's the part I love, is teaching people how to do this. And I think for a lot of people who might be a little timid to be out in the darkness in the middle of the night, I mean, I'll speak for me as a woman, that was something I worried about a whole lot at first. And I feel so comfortable being out at night, even by myself, even down at Big Bend in the middle of the night. I feel great. So it's built a lot of confidence in me, this hobby, and I have watched other people. It does the same. So it's addicting, and it builds a lot of confidence. So I just love it. So, but that's just a little bit about me. And also, I'm in the Dallas Fort Worth area. You guys are all down near the valley, I understand. I think so. So it's great to be a part of your group, and I wanted to thank you too for letting me join in and talk. So what I'm going to do is share my screen for the presentation here. Here we go. All right, I think, can everybody see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Super.
Yes.
Right.
If everyone will mute themselves and close your video out, that will give us the best quality possible. Thank you.
All right, so I did a similar talk for, like Ruth said, Linda Nichols' Happiness Hour, and it's basically photographing the Milky Way for beginners, meant for people who've not done much night photography with star photography. So I'm really going to tell you how to get started and how to plan. I have to say, getting out and actually doing it's one of those things where it takes a lot of practice to get better. You learn your mistakes, and often you don't realize your mistakes until you get back home and you look at your files, unfortunately. And then you realize what you want to do differently, or how you want to frame something different, or maybe you decide you do want to get a better lens, or and so a lot of times it's a lot of effort for practice. So I wanted to focus on how to get started and how to plan for pictures. For me, I mentioned Big Bend. That's where I like to go to get my night sky photography pictures. And like I said, it takes 9 hours for me to get there. So I want to make sure I'm fully prepared. And this is kind of what I'll teach people in workshops too. Okay, so I'm going to talk about when do we photograph, and specifically I'm actually going to focus on the Milky Way. There's so many things to talk about with night sky photography, but I'm really going to talk about pinpoint stars and getting really good Milky Way photographs. So I'm going to go over when to photograph and where to photograph, the required equipment that you need, what's the best lens, and certainly I like to kind of focus on what's the best lens to start out with if you're a beginner. What are your camera settings, and then what are your exposure settings, and how does that work together? How in the world do you focus at night, which is probably the #1 question I get all the time. And then talk about a couple other things, like what are some other things that are useful to have and do in night photography. And then once you really get some beginner skills down, what's next? The journey of learning basic Milky Way silhouette photography and to advanced techniques has really been awesome for me. I mean, I have enjoyed learning so many different techniques in the advanced realm. And so I love teaching and talking about that as well with people. So I can kind of talk about how can you get beyond the silhouette typical Milky Way shot. So let me talk about when we photograph first. There's a couple of things involved with when. I'm going to talk about what Milky Way season means when somebody says, hey, the Milky Way's out, or when is the Milky Way out? There's actually a season, and I'll talk about what that means in a second. I'm going to talk about when you should photograph around the moon cycle, what time of the night you should actually photograph, and also how do you deal with the weather. So first, let's focus on the Milky Way season. Milky Way season, we often say, when's the Milky Way going to be out? Well, we're in the Milky Way, so any star that we actually see in the sky with our human eye is all in the Milky Way. I mean, every single star when we go outside that we see with our human eye, that's in our own galaxy. You can't see anything with the human eye that's outside our galaxy. Now, if you get a camera and you take a long exposure, you can actually see Andromeda. And so that's our neighboring galaxy. But it's really hard to see Andromeda with the human eye. But regardless, our season, when we say season, that's actually when we look into the core. So your typical picture of the Milky Way, where you see that really dense middle colorful part that's got a dark, we call it the dark rift in the middle. That's actually the core. And when we say the core, if we're looking at our galaxy anatomy right here, we're actually way out here on one of these arms, the spiraling arms. So when we look to the middle of our galaxy, we're looking toward the core. And that's actually what we see in the northern hemisphere between March and October at night. So this part is above the horizon at night between March and October. And we often say winter Milky Way. And when we do that, we're actually looking away from the middle of our galaxy. And that's actually at night between October and March. So this is kind of an example of a typical winter Milky Way picture. You can definitely see like a band of stars, but you're not seeing that really bright contrast core with all the colors. And, you know, I talked about being in Big Bend a little bit. Often I will enjoy more shooting in Big Bend in the wintertime than I do in the summer, because in the summer, as you guys are probably familiar, it is incredibly hot. And I'll talk about noise in a bit, but the more noise, the more heat you have, the more you have to deal with noise on your sensor. And when you're out in really, really dark skies, even a winter Milky Way shows up pretty well in your pictures. So I enjoy shooting winter a little bit more than I do in summer in Big Bend. So that's kind of what we mean by Milky Way season. And so I want to talk a little bit about actually how does the Milky Way orientation change throughout the season, because it does change a little bit. And I've tried here to draw some circles that kind of represent the band of the Milky Way, and the large circle here is really the middle core, if you will. And so early in the Milky Way season, March, when the Milky Way does start to rise above the horizon, you're getting kind of a flat arch, if you will. And as it tends to rise above the horizon, that arch actually gets a little bit bigger. And then what happens is the left side of that arch just kind of extends out up into the sky. And as the season moves forward, as we get later into the season, such as right now, pretty late in the sky around 2 a.m., you see a Milky Way that looks like this. And as the season progresses, the Milky Way starts to look a little bit like it's slanting to the right. So if it's going straight up and down vertical, you know that's fairly late in the season. That's usually July, August, and September. And if it's starting to arch over to the right, that's actually more like September, October. So that's actually how it moves in the sky throughout the season. And it doesn't always come up at the same time or set at the same time. And there are several apps that you can look up when the core rises and when it sets. And PhotoPills apps is my favorite. I didn't put a lot of PhotoPills slides in here to talk about it because it is another learning curve of itself. But for example, when I talk about the Milky Way core rising at a certain time, in March, for example, when I do workshops in Big Bend, it won't rise in early March until like 3:30 a.m. in the morning. And this is what you'll see in early March. Whereas it basically, as the season goes on, it rises earlier and earlier in the evening. So right about now, the Milky Way rises at 11:30 at night. In another month, it'll be rising at 10:30. And so if you want to go photograph the Milky Way and you are not a really, I could stay awake all night or wake up at 3:30 to shoot that Milky Way, then you don't want to go look at it or try to see it in March. Ideally, it's better to go try to photograph it in July or August, because pretty much right when it gets dark or after astronomical twilight ends, that's when you can see the core. It will already be out. So there's difference in the times it's visible in the night sky throughout the year as well. So I want to kind of focus on, that was kind of when to shoot the Milky Way throughout the season. Now I want to talk about when do we shoot the Milky Way throughout the month moon cycle. Shooting the Milky Way with the moon in the sky is going to cause that Milky Way to disappear a little bit. So this is an example where the moon, this is actually down, I think, in Galveston, and the moon was starting to rise above the horizon, or it might have been setting actually. And it's behind a cloud, but this was a less than 4% moon, and you can see how bright it is. This exposure is probably about 20 to 25 seconds. And what happened is that moon is so bright that you basically barely can see the Milky Way. It's kind of looking a little hazy. So you just don't get that really, really good contrast that you see without the moon. So it's really helpful to shoot the Milky Way without that moon in the sky. Now, if the moon happens to be at a different area of the sky, let's say, for example, the moon was rising and that was behind me, then I would get a little bit more of this Milky Way. But because this moon is so close to the Milky Way, it's almost an impossible shot to get with a really contrasted Milky Way. So you really want to try to aim to shoot it when there's no moon in the sky or very little moon. And that's not always around the new moon. For example, you can pick the weekend or a couple days before and after the new moon where maybe the moon doesn't really rise until, I don't know, 3 a.m., and so if the Milky Way is already out at 10 p.m. and the moon doesn't come up until 3 a.m., then you can go shoot the Milky Way. So a lot of times people say you have to be there during a new moon, but that's not always the case. So this is an example actually of a moon that was at 15%, which was really pretty bright. And this was just before it was setting. And so in this case, it's a little bit further away from the Milky Way, but again, I just don't have that really nice contrast. in the Milky Way because that moon is so close. This particular picture is right out of the camera without any editing. And this particular picture, I just brought up the exposure in Lightroom. And it just kind of shows you, it just isn't a lot of contrast around the Milky Way. Still a great picture. I mean, there's nothing wrong with taking it, but if you're really looking for that nice, really bright contrast Milky Way, you generally don't want to have the moon. So, and this is just another example of once the moon set, this is the same location, and I didn't change my settings at all in the camera. But once that moon set, you get a very different color in the sky. One of the things I love about night sky photography is the change in the color in the sky depending on conditions. In this particular case, anytime you have a moon in the sky, your sky is going to look very blue because all that light into the sky is just going to make your sky blue, just like the sun does for us. But as soon as that moon went down, this was actually a very stormy day. And when there's a lot of water vapor in the air, the skies tend to be more of an aqua green most of the time down in South Texas. And so sure enough, the sky was clearing here and we get that really aqua green color. And again, this is straight out of the camera. And when I edit most of my pictures in Lightroom, I just up the exposure. So I don't really add any color to my Milky Ways at all. I just bring out the light just a little bit more. So then I talked about when's the best time to shoot the Milky Way over the moon cycle. Now the question is, when's the best time to shoot the Milky Way in the night? And so you really want to get, if you want to get a very bright Milky Way with a lot of contrast, the best time to shoot it is after what's called astronomical twilight ends in the evening, and then before it starts in the morning. And so if this is our sunset, and we're going to shoot the Milky Way that night, we go through what's called civil, nautical, and astronomical twilight. And all of that depends on the angle of the sun on the horizon and below the horizon. So 6 degrees, 12 degrees, 18 degrees. And so what's happening is we're getting a lot of light bending into our atmosphere, even when the sun is below the horizon. Not until that sun gets 18 degrees below the horizon or lower, that's when we really don't have any more light from the sun anyway in our atmosphere. So that's the darkest the atmosphere is going to be for us if there's no other light. And what I really mean about that is like the moon. And so if you wait for the moon to be gone or you shoot during a new moon, the best time to shoot the Milky Way is between when astronomical twilight ends and when astronomical twilight begins. This is when your settings on your camera, once you set your settings, if nobody's like turning on bright lights or there's not a lot of cars or there's no other lights involved and the moon is gone, your settings can stay the same. Whereas if you like set your settings during nautical or astronomical twilight, because the light in the atmosphere is changing, you're going to have to change your settings on your camera. So I usually kind of tell folks, don't really set those Milky Way settings until you know astronomical twilight has ended. And again, that's usually about an hour after sunset and an hour before sunrise. Again, Milky Way or PhotoPills app, if you're not familiar with it, it's a $10 app. I think it's still $10. It is the best app I use for planning and knowing when to shoot Milky Way. And it is worth the money. And if you have shot Milky Way or you are thinking you might get into night sky photography, it's the best $10 I've probably spent on an app, period. So I talked about when to photograph. I kind of want to insert a weather comment here. So, you know, you've planned when in the month you're going to photograph. You've planned when and during the moon cycle and when during the night. And for me, if I know I'm going to drive maybe 3 or 5 hours somewhere to go shoot that night, I always want to look at the weather to make sure it's worth it. And the one app I go to quite a bit, it's actually a website. They do not have an app, but it's called cleardarksky.com. There's an app that's fairly new. It's called Clear Outside. And it kind of serves the same purpose. But this particular website, Clear Dark Sky, is great because it can give you information about your cloud cover in a particular area up to about 48 hours in advance. So if I'm in Big Bend, I'm in Big Bend, and I don't really use this because I'm already there and I've already driven my 9 hours. But if I'm somewhere where I don't want to drive 3 or 5 hours and I want to know, is it going to be cloudy, 5 hour radius from here, I can generally find a spot near there and look at the cloud cover. If there's going to be cloud cover, these squares will turn white, and so this will give you a great idea throughout the night if it's worth the drive or not. There's nothing worse than driving really far to get somewhere and not even being able to see a star because of the clouds. So this gives you a good idea. And I've found clear dark sky to be pretty accurate, maybe 80% of the time, whereas sometimes weather forecasts don't work well. And the reason I say that is, I'm not always necessarily looking for a completely clear or completely clear sky. Sometimes clouds in the Milky Way or around the Milky Way, kind of give the picture some character sometimes. So this gives me an idea if it's completely overcast, what the transparency is or not. So it's a really good website to use. So I've talked about when to photograph. Let me kind of talk about where's the best place to photograph, especially if you're looking for a really great, awesome Milky Way. If you haven't heard of the Bortle scale, and you guys probably have, the Bortle scale is a scale that's used for understanding or being able to explain how dark the sky is or light the sky is from light pollution. And so the Bortle scale basically goes from 1 to 9, 8, 9, 7 being suburban cities, 1 being some of the darkest skies or the darkest skies on the planet. And so, if you can look at the picture here, it's really hard to see a Milky Way when you get to like Bortle 5, 6, 7, and 8. This is like Dallas, Fort Worth here. So when I try to shoot Milky Way, I try to stay in 3, 2, and 1. And of course, Big Bend has Bortle scale 1 skies that are just amazing. And that's kind of defined by you really don't see any light pollution on the horizon at all. Bortle scale 2 is where you do see light pollution on the horizon. So there's definitely parts of Big Bend where you get close to some of the cities and towns nearby and you'll see some lights. But there are definitely places, as you guys may know, where you go into Big Bend, you can't see a single light anywhere on the horizon. And that's kind of what I aim for on a lot of shots. And so we're in Texas. This is some of my favorite places to shoot in Texas. But it just kind of gives you an idea of the light pollution around. So if, there's a place near Dallas, Fort Worth, it takes about 2.5 hours to get to, and it's a historic fort, Fort Griffin. And that is actually in a Bortle 2 sky. So some pretty dark skies, but you will get light pollution on the horizon. If you're familiar with Palagero Canyon and Caprock Canyon, some of those are Bortle 3 and Bortle 2 skies as well. Pretty dark in that area. And as we get down into, of course, Big Bend, we've got some of the darkest skies in the state right down here. So those are the Bortle 1 skies. But you can go to lightpollutionmap.com, and there's a couple other really good light pollution websites that help. Lightpollutionmap.com will actually show you how light pollution has changed over time in the last 15 years. And one of the big worries we have right now is the light pollution is just creeping into West Texas. And if you don't know, right now, Big Bend National Park, as well as Big Bend State Park, are both international dark sky parks. The observatory in the Davis Mountains there is right now applying for their dark sky, international dark sky status. And if they get approved, we will have the largest conglomerate dark sky park in the world. All 3 of those areas will be the largest in the world. So I'm real excited about that. I've been contacted by Big Bend National Park to try to teach some of their park rangers how to do night photography because ironically nobody knows how. And so we're working on that to try to get a grant to teach their staff how to get more pictures rather than borrowing pictures from other photographers. But naturally I could talk about Big Bend until I'm blue in the face here. So we'll move on here. Okay, So I want to talk a little bit about camera requirements and what do you want to set up on your camera before you really start shooting. Um, so, you ultimately you need a camera that will go in full manual mode. Occasionally I'll have somebody who will have a camera and for some reason it won't go in full manual mode. It's probably a crop sensor camera, a little bit older. And so you need to be able to manipulate your aperture and your shutter speed and your ISO all independently. Most of the newer DSLR mirrorless cameras are awesome. The sensor is very sensitive, but I run into folks every now and then that might have an older, like a 10-year-old camera or a camera that just won't go into full manual mode. So that's the most important thing. The older cameras will have a little bit more of an issue with noise, and I'll talk about what noise is in a sec. But the newer cameras, the sensors tend to do really, really well. And it doesn't matter if it's a crop sensor camera or a full frame camera, both of those sensors are still really good, especially if they have been made within the last 5 or 6 years. And you want to make sure your camera can at least get up to like ISO 1600 or 3200. For the most part, most of the newer cameras these days can go quite a bit higher. But every now and then I'll have somebody in one of my workshops where they'll have an older camera and their camera won't get past 1600. And so we do struggle a little bit to get them some really good pictures. And I think 9 times out of 10, after the workshop, they end up buying a camera. So, okay. So I want to talk about the noise example. I used to shoot with the Canon 5D Mark II. It's an older camera. It was made in 2008. And now I actually shoot with Sony, but I was shooting with a Canon D6. And even then, the Canon D6 still had quite a bit of noise. And so if I kind of zoom in here on that Mark II, that 5D Mark II picture, you can see all the artifact here and all the noise. So the 5D Mark II was an older model and definitely struggled. The Mark IV, if you have that, that's definitely a newer model before Canon went mirrorless and is a whole lot better at noise. And even the 6D, I still had quite a bit of an issue with noise, but I actually have converted to Sony and the mirrorless model that they have, and it works wonders when it comes to not quite as much noise, and also I have converted to Sony. I just absolutely love it. Still work with my Canon every now and then, but I'm mostly now a Sony user. Okay, so I want to talk about what's the best lens. So if you're a beginner, I usually tell people get a wide angle lens, but at the very least, just get a lens that has a very wide aperture. And wide meaning 2.8 or bigger. And so for the aperture number, that transitions to a 2.0 or a 1.8 or a 1.4. But get a fast lens. And I say that because if you get a lens that won't open up as wide, you're not going to let as much light into your sensor, and it's going to be really difficult to get really bright stars. Now, if you're doing an advanced technique called tracking, you can track with a kit lens and get an amazing shot. But as a beginner, most people don't start out tracking at all. And so I recommend you get a wide angle lens. As I learned night photography and as I learned Milky Way photography, I actually enjoyed my zoom lens or a prime lens more than a wide angle. So for example, this is my 50 millimeter, and I'll talk about settings in a second on exposure, but my wide angle lens, I'm able to do a longer shutter speed and not get obvious star trails in the shot. So this is a 25-second, but I definitely have a very wide field of exposure here. Whereas with my 50 prime, that Milky Way looks a whole lot bigger, and that's one of the things I like. But I won't be able to use the shutter speed as long. And again, I'll talk about the difference here in a second. But I absolutely love shooting with my 50 prime more than I do my wide angle lens. But if you're a beginner, it just helps kind of understand how it all works together when you use a wide angle lens at first. So, okay. Other required equipment. It's really important to have a sturdy tripod. And I usually tell folks, most of the folks who might be listening tonight, y'all are probably bird photographers, landscape photographers. You know the value in having a very sturdy tripod. Um, Having a center pole is often for landscape photography a pain as well. So I try really hard to tell people, don't spend money on a tripod that's you're gonna not enjoy in a month. Don't go cheap on the tripod. Buy something that's sturdy and if you think you're gonna enjoy landscape photography, do without the center pole. Those get a little bit more expensive, but if you can do it, it helps. And the other thing that's important is an intervalometer. You actually don't need an intervalometer to take Milky Way shots. You can put your camera on a delay, and the only reason you need to use an intervalometer, sometimes I'll teach people about trying to do star trails or stacking many pictures together for star trails. So it's actually not required for a Milky Way shot, but I use an intervalometer for star trails, so I'll connect it to my camera, so I'll use it as a release as well. In other words, I'll put it on a delay, so I'm not touching the camera, I'm touching the release on the intervalometer. So that helps out as well. Okay, so let's talk exposure settings. So this is kind of usually the number 2 question I get all the time, besides how do you focus at night? It's what exposure settings do you use? And, exposure settings are going to vary based on your ambient light, your border scale and the sky, atmospheric light, your camera, and your lens. So it's going to be different for everybody. Even if we all lined up and got in the same sky, your camera is going to be different and your lenses are going to be different. So I'm going to kind of talk about what to start working with and then how to adjust your settings. So I kind of tell everybody my acronym is ASI, and you really want to set your camera settings in this order. You want to start with aperture, then you want to set your shutter speed, and then you want to set your ISO, and I'll kind of tell you why. So the first reason you want to start with aperture is because that's easy. We know that we want to open up our aperture as wide as we can go. There's a couple reasons why you wouldn't do that, and I'll talk about that in a second. But in general, just open up that aperture as wide as you can go. So if your lens goes to 2.8, open it to 2.8. If it goes to 1.8, open it to 1.8. But start there for your aperture. Next is your shutter speed. So if you want to take a really sharp, crisp Milky Way picture, it looks better if there's no star trails. If you shoot the Milky Way and you have star trails, it kind of looks like a weird, blurry mess. It's not really my favorite, although some people like it, and that's subjective. But if you want a really, really crisp Milky Way shot, you really want pinpoint stars. And so there's a couple of different ways to kind of figure this out. And for beginners, I always talk about the 500 rule. Some other people also use the 400 rule. And with some of the newer mirrorless cameras and sensors these days, there's also what's called an NPF rule, which is very little time. But I'm going to focus on the 500 rule for beginners. It's really simple. What you're going to do is you're going to basically take the focal length divided by, you're going to take 5 divided by the focal length. I think that this is wrong here, but 5 divided by the focal length is going to give you the time. And so, for example, if I have a 24 millimeter prime lens, I'm just going to take 5 divided by 24, and I get something like 20.8 seconds. Now, obviously, my camera is not going to do that, but I always dial down, so I don't want to shoot over 20 seconds. And if I have a wide angle lens and I keep to the 500 rule and I don't like crop in and majorly zoom into my picture, I'm not going to see star trails. But if I have maybe a 50 millimeter lens and I happen to crop in, that 20 seconds actually won't be enough. So naturally, I'll have another number for the 500 divided by 50. But even if I crop in a little bit, I'll start to get trails. So a more advanced technique for people who are no longer beginners is called the NPF rule. And that's a really complicated formula. And again, I'm going to credit PhotoPills. They have a little section in their app where they'll figure it out for you. So long story short, 500 rule for the shutter speed, and that'll give you what your shutter speed is. And bottom line, just don't go over that amount with time. unless you really need to let more light into your sensor. But if you want pinpoint stars, just stop at that 500 rule. Okay, so finally we're going to get to ISO. And in general, if we're in really, really dark skies, I'll generally tell people start at 2800 or 3200, and then adjust your ISO from there. And so what does that really mean? Well, I'll talk about that in a second on how you would adjust. I mean, essentially, if you look at the back of your picture and you look at the back of your camera and you decide, I barely can see any stars, so there's not much light at all, then we want to increase our ISO. And again, the ISO is increasing our sensitivity to our sensor to the light. But anytime you increase ISO, you're going to basically increase the possibility of having noise come into that picture. And so every camera has basically an ISO maximum capability. And there's a way to test that even in your own living room at night. You don't have to be in the middle of the field. But for my 6D, I couldn't really shoot above 5,000 ISO without a lot of noise coming in. But for my Sony, I can shoot 8,000 ISO or 10,000 ISO, and on some nights I won't have any noise. So it all depends on your camera. But if your picture is too bright or there's a lot of noise, then you want to decrease your ISO. So I generally say, as a rule for Milky Way photography, ISO is the last setting you want to deal with and adjust. Everything else is kind of set based on the rules that we have in your aperture. Okay, so I wanted to kind of circle back on why would you want to bring down your aperture. Sometimes if your aperture, for every lens, there's always a sweet spot on maximum sharpness. And it's certainly not when the aperture is open as wide as possible. So, and some lenses, especially cheaper lenses, so I used to work with a Rokinon 24 on my Canon. And whenever I would open that up as wide as it would go, I would get these crazy flares like on Jupiter or really bright stars. And so I would have to bring my aperture down a stop. And I have to bring it up to like 1.8 or 2 in order to stop this flare. So always use that aperture really wide, take that test shot, but I want you to really look at the brightest stars, because if you see a lot of flare, then go ahead and stop down. That would be a reason why you don't want to bring your aperture all the way open. It doesn't really happen on really nice lenses. Those are usually the more expensive lenses, but we tend to see it on some of the Rokinon lenses, and I've seen it on a couple Canon lenses as well. And then shutter speed, you don't want to adjust shutter speed too much once you're obeying the 500 rule or the NPF rule. If you're increasing, if you want more light in your picture, so let's say you maybe have a really old camera, a really old sensor, and you're just not getting the amount of light you want. I mean, you can increase shutter speed, you can do a longer shot. Just know that you're going to get more star trails coming through. And some people are okay with that. You don't have to shoot the Milky Way. You can kind of shoot some other areas of the sky. But if you decrease your shutter speed, basically slow it down, you're going to get more trails. Okay. And then this is the slide where I talk a little bit about the ISO. So increasing your ISO is going to increase your camera's sensitivity to light. So it will appear, or it'll let more light in, if you will. But increasing your ISO is going to increase more noise. I mentioned too before, you can test your camera's ISO maximum capabilities. F-Stoppers has a really great article to talk about that. If you go to their website and you just search their education section and just put in test ISO, but there's a couple ways to test it in your own living room at night. That way, when you get into the field, you'll know, oh, I know that this camera really can't go beyond 8,000 ISO, so I don't even want to bother. And there's a couple other options to decrease noise in your camera. So most cameras these days have what's called a long exposure noise reduction. And that is actually, what happens is your camera will take a picture and then it will close the shutter and it'll take another picture of the exact same shutter speed, which is basically a dark frame. And cameras will have an algorithm where they will look at, every time you take a shot, your noise is always different in every shot. And so it'll look at what changed and what where the noise is different. And then some cameras are better than others, but it'll try to subtract all of that noise from the final shot. So it does all that in camera, and then it gives you an image with less noise. So turning on what I say linear, but turning on your long exposure noise reduction will help reduce some of the noise. And again, some cameras are a lot better at it than others. Just know if you don't want to wait for that whole process to happen, and if you're not patient like me, because I never use it, then you may not want to wait. So an example is if I'm taking like, sometimes I'll do a long exposure of like a 3-minute shot, and the last thing I want to do is wait 3 minutes for that photograph to process. Um, but if I am in Big Bend in the middle of July, and occasionally that happens, and it's 101 out at 2 a.m., then you better bet I have my long exposure noise reduction on, because all of that heat hitting, working with the sensor is just bringing in a lot of noise into my shot. So there's a couple other options to reduce noise. They're a little advanced, but there's something called stacking to reduce noise. And if you're on a Mac, there's a program called Starry Landscape Stacker. This one costs a little bit of money. If you're on a Windows or PC, sorry, there's an application called Sequitur, and I believe Sequitur is free. And what you can do is stack a number of photos, and both of these programs have algorithms where it'll kind of do what your camera was going to do during linear, but they've done several inquiries really looking in the science behind this, and it's about an estimate of 11 to 14 photos you need to stack to help reduce the noise. So if you've got the time and you know your camera's really noisy, go ahead and take about 15 photos, and then you can stack them later in post-processing. There's a ton of videos out there on YouTube that shows you how to do that. And a lot of those are free, so it's pretty easy to do. Okay, a couple other camera settings that I definitely tell people to do. Shoot in RAW. When you shoot in RAW, you're going to have a whole lot more information to use in post-processing for editing than you would if you were shooting JPEG. And so absolutely shoot in RAW. If you're trying to bring up a lot of the dark areas or the really dark shadows from your histogram and your image, RAW is going to give you a whole lot more data than if you were in JPEG. So definitely shoot in RAW. And again, I mentioned a linear long exposure noise reduction. That will help you a whole lot. Turn that on if you need to. The only time I don't like to use it is if I don't want to be patient, or if I'm doing stacking for star trails, which is a whole nother kind of discussion on how that happens. But if you're trying to take photos back to back to back, and you need them to be immediately back to back for star trails, you can't have linear on for that to work. And the other thing I mentioned is turn off all other lights on your camera. That usually happens when you have a shutter delay or you have your camera on autofocus, which you really can't do at night anyway. And so turn those off, because those lights can actually mess up your exposure settings. So a couple more camera settings. Some really, really fancy lenses have what's called image stabilization, and that is meant to help stabilize your lens if you are not on a tripod. So if you are on a tripod, turn that off, because that actually can do the opposite. And for white balance, I like to talk a little bit about white balance during my workshops, but I always tell people take it off of automatic. And the reason I say that is a lot of times I'll teach people some advanced techniques on how to stack and make blends and make composites. And a lot of times that involves layers in Photoshop. And if you leave your camera on auto white balance, it doesn't matter if you take one picture 1 second behind another picture, it can change the color of those two pictures. And you can leave the settings the same, but what's changing is any atmospheric light, any side lights, any atmospheric moisture. All of those things have a ton of influence on how your picture decides the color of your sky is going to be. So if you keep your camera on a Kelvin scale, and my favorite is 3800, it will take the same picture and the same colors pretty much every picture. But if you let your camera decide what the colors of your picture is going to be, it's terrible. And so it doesn't really lend itself well to advanced techniques when you're learning how to blend pictures together or when you're learning how to stack. Um, and again, for almost all of my Milky Way, I never add colors. These are all ambient colors that just happen to be in the sky. And so, you know, there's kind of a really bizarre magenta color right next to a green, but that's all because of water vapor and things like that going on. So I just tell people, you know, find something on the Kelvin scale. You know, Milky Way color is very subjective. Some people like very warm Milky Way. Some people like bright white or just more blue. And all of that can be changed in post-processing. But the one thing I do tell people is just don't leave it on automatic white balance, because then you will see every other picture be slightly different color. And that's enough to kind of just drive me crazy. So, okay, I kind of want to talk about how to focus at night. It is probably the #1 question I get, and people struggle with it quite a bit when they're new. So there's a couple ways we could do it. If you need to focus on infinity, that's kind of the goal. Stars are at infinity. But if you look at your lens and you find that infinity icon on some of the lenses, that's not always true infinity, and every lens is going to be slightly different. So you're not able to just turn your lens to that infinity icon and then shoot. We actually have to do a really precise focus. There's a couple ways we could focus at night. So I could focus during the daytime or blue hour and put tape on my lens and hope it doesn't move, which is really unrealistic, especially if you're going like from one spot to another. I could focus on the moon or a high contrast area on horizon, and sometimes I can even put my camera in autofocus and do that. But same thing, if I bump my lens or if I move locations and change it, that's also unrealistic. It may not stay. And so what I do is I teach people how to use their live view on the back of their camera and focus on the brightest star in the sky or a really bright light way off in the distance. And the way we do that is you're going to use your live LCD screen. So you're going to put it on live view, and then you're going to like crank your settings up. You're just going to crank your ISO up because you really want to see some stars. And if your settings are fairly low, you probably won't see them. And what you're going to do is you want to find in live view the brightest star in the sky, and with the magnifying glass, not with the focal lens, but with the magnifying glass, you're going to zoom with the live view into that star. And once you've kind of zoomed in, then you want to adjust your focal ring until that star is the tiniest point you can make it. And I wish I had a video in here to show you guys how it works, but essentially it's going to look like a big blob. But as you get it in focus, it's going to look like the tiniest little point. And that actually means it's in focus to infinity. Take your shot, and then most importantly, zoom in and check. If you see something that looks like this, then it's blurry. It's not in focus. And oftentimes, if you don't check your focus often, especially after moving your camera or moving your tripod, you might realize that all of your shots are blurry. So I tell folks, constantly check your focus. Don't assume that your camera didn't get bumped or your lens didn't get bumped, because it's terrible when you drive a long way and then you get home and you realize all your pictures are out of focus. So constantly check your focus. And the way to do that is take the shot and look at the shot by zooming in. Don't just assume it looks like it's in focus, because you can see little dots on the back of your screen. So, and the other thing I tell people is, you know, I never tape my lenses down, but once I have found my infinity point, mark your lens. So I've taken a pencil and marked where infinity is on my, this is a Rokinon 24. And notice it's not at the infinity symbol. It's not at this line. It's actually kind of in between. But if for some reason I can't focus on infinity, and the reason that might happen would be last weekend I was in Big Bend, and we had 2 nights of pure cloud skies. So there wasn't a star in the sky or a light on the horizon anywhere. So I had to figure out what the heck was going to be infinity. And if I had this lens with me, I would have been able to figure it out. And there are times where I will shoot in cloudy skies because I'll light paint, and I'll light paint foreground objects. So I still want to know what infinity is. So, Couple of the things you want to bring with you when you go out that are so helpful: a chair, bug spray, snacks, caffeine, first aid kit. A red light will help save your night vision, but a red light will ruin everybody's shot. So I try to tell folks that I take out, I'd rather people have a white light, but just point it down. For me, red light actually does help you save your night vision. And again, I'm always talking Big Ben, but I tell people to always walk around with that light pointed down when they're walking to not step on a snake, which has been very close to happening a couple times. And a couple of things on night photography. I do try to tell people there is a night photography etiquette. One of the biggest things is before you turn on a light, if you're around other people, is just ask, hey, are you open? And that just means, if somebody's shooting, before you turn on any light, it's just really nice thing to do, because all it takes is you turn on that red light or you turn on a light and you've ruined someone's shot. So it's just a nice thing to do in night photography etiquette. Another thing that I remind people is, if you have one of those cars where anytime you open the door, all the lights turn on and flash, that's going to ruin people's shots. So try to, turn those off if you are going to be with a bunch of people shooting and your car's nearby. And I have been in a lot of places where there's a ton of night photographers, and I've been by myself. I do that quite a bit up in the Pacific Northwest, and it's always good to announce yourself when you know you might be near other people. And I usually know because I see a little tiny red dot off in the distance, and the last thing you want to do is accidentally surprise somebody, and you never know if they have a gun or not. So I always try to say, hey there, how are you? And that always helps. You never want to sneak up on somebody or on purpose not say anything. You certainly don't want to surprise anybody in the middle of the night. So, and then a couple things I like to talk about once people really get going and practice shooting the Milky Way, what's next? Because when you first start out, you're shooting a lot of silhouettes and you're not light painting yet. You're not really working too much on composition, but once you kind of get going, you learn how to scout in the daytime, and you learn how to use augmented reality and photo pills. They have a section in their app that's really helpful to know where the Milky Way is going to be at a certain day, at a certain time of the night. So you can actually start planning your shots to figure out what you might want to shoot when you're back at that same place in 3 months. So that's really helpful. And then when you kind of get beyond basic Milky Way shooting, so this is an example where, it's just a basic silhouette with the Milky Way. You can kind of start light painting, and there's different ways to do that. You can light paint with your arms, so you're really kind of painting the object. Or in this case, I've actually set some very low level lights inside a ruin, and I'm light painting the outside at the same time during a 20-second exposure. So you start really playing around with light painting and understanding how that works with your exposure settings. And that is definitely a learning curve in itself as well. And then beyond there, you can learn how to shoot panoramics. That's pretty easy to stitch together in Lightroom and or in Photoshop. The goal with panoramics, and it's very similar to daytime panoramics, is you just want to kind of capture 50% of the picture before. And if you can even do this in the daytime without a tripod, but at night you definitely need that tripod. And then Lightroom and Photoshop can stitch them together pretty easily. And then really when you get to more advanced techniques, you start blending. And so there's two types of blendings that I teach in my workshops, blue hour blending and moonlight blending. And this is an example of moonlight blending where I'll on purpose have a workshop where the moon's in the sky half the night. So in this case, this is Santolina Canyon with the moonlight on it, and no Milky Way was up in the sky yet. So this is before Milky Way came out. The moon was setting. And about 2 hours later, the moon was gone. The Milky Way started showing up. And so you can put these two images in layers in Photoshop and bring in the details of the canyon that you weren't able to get without the moonlight. So same thing, you can do the same thing with blue hour blending. And it just means you don't move that tripod at all, but you take that shot during blue hour, and then you take that shot when the Milky Way's out and you're not able to see that foreground in the middle of the night, and then you blend them in Photoshop. And getting better at that technique over time is something that is really fun to do. But once you get really good at that, you learn how to make composites if you're not a purist. It's quite fun. I used to be a purist, and now I'm afraid I do a lot of blending and a lot of composites. And you can do blending and composites without moving the tripod and moving the tripod. So you get a little bit more advanced with that. And so here's an example with a composite, two completely different photos taken. This one's taken in the middle of the day. This one's taken at night. And this is just kind of an example of totally not being a purist here, but just playing around with Milky Way images and pictures. So that's a little more advanced if that's even something that you like to do. So, and then, you know, there's star trails and clouds, and I will still photograph on cloudy nights. If the clouds are moving really fast, it's totally fun to try to get the stars between them and get the movement of the clouds while you're like painting. So this is me brushing this big large rock here with light over probably a 30-second exposure. So I absolutely love light painting and teach people how to do it. And then star trails is equally just as fun. Again, there's a whole nother kind of side of talking about star trails, and there's different ways to create them. They're very different depending on where you look in the sky and what lens you're using. So I absolutely love taking star trails, and it's a whole nother side of night photography that I think is actually more enjoyable. But you have to have a lot of patience and a lot of time. So, and then tracking, I've been getting into tracking the last 2 years. And what tracking does essentially is, you know, we are spinning pretty fast. And so we say star trails, but that's because the Earth is spinning around. And so if we want to capture the Milky Way in a longer exposure and ignore that 500 rule, what you can do is you can essentially put your camera on a motor that goes against the Earth's spin and sticks with the stars, right? So those are called trackers. There's a bunch out on the market now. There's some really easy to use trackers now, and there's some more complex trackers. I use the Star Adventure tracker. And so this is a 30-second exposure with my 50 millimeter. And you can just see all the star trails. It's a blurry mess. And this is the same shot with my tracked 30-second exposure. So you get a whole lot of detail in a tracked shot because I'm basically taking a Milky Way shot while it's being tracked. So all that light's hitting my sensor without the star trail movement. So I'm going to get a whole lot more detail in my Milky Way. I'm going to get a lot more nebulas that I wouldn't get if I weren't tracking this. So it's an advanced technique that once you really get down Milky Way photography, tracking is just, I don't know, for me, the hunger has always been there to just get better and better and start tracking. So it's quite fun to do, but it's amazing what you can put together with track photos. So that's kind of it. You know, that's just kind of a really beginner's guide to getting started and learning how to shoot Milky Way. And like I said, I do workshops. You can get more info at the nightphotographyworkshops.com. Everything's sold out this year, and I'm about to put together dates for next year. And we had to take time off from Mount Rainier because of the pandemic, but we're going to bring Mount Rainier back next year. So I'm excited about that. So any questions?
Start off with a question if it.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I actually don't have a DSLR camera. What I was looking at doing is to see if I could try this with a Fujifilm X100S with a wide lens conversion on.
You can certainly try it.
Okay.
You know, I have film, right? You're talking film, right? I have not shot with film at?
No, it's not a film camera. It's a reasonably new camera.
Which one is it again?
Fuji film. It's a X100S.
Okay.
And it has a a wide lens conversion. Let's see. That's what it looks like.
So it's a digital, yeah. I mean,
yes.
Go for it. So I'm curious, how far does it go on ISO?
Excuse me?
What's the ISO? How far up does it go on ISO?
I think it'll go up to 3200.
Yeah, you certainly could do it and try it. Yeah, I recommend
okay.
it. What the lens that's on it? How far wide is it open?
It's an f2, and it will, with the wide lens conversion, it well, it's nominally at see, it's, I think it's like 35 millimeter, but with the wide lens conversion on it, it converts it to 28 millimeter.
Yeah, you could do it. Try it and see what you get.
Okay.
Absolutely. Again, I'm not familiar with that camera, so I don't know how it will fare, but absolutely, I mean, go for it. It'll be interesting to see what you get. Other questions?
I have a question, Shari. When summer comes on, do you just depart Texas for the summer, or do you just make multiple trips?
For going down, getting
to the
away.
Northwest.
So normally when, like, I just did a workshop in Big Bend last weekend, and I probably won't be there again now till September. Unless I decide to go down for a meteor shower, I might be there for the Perseus, but I try not to go back, mainly because it's so hot at night even.
Yeah.
All of that heat just adds more noise to the sensor. And I actually that's when I decided to go north. So I used to live in Seattle, and I'm going to be in Oregon in 2 weeks, and I'll be there for a week. And then I was in Utah a little bit, and I'll probably go back to Utah. So I try to go a little bit where it's not quite as hot. But yeah, and then I'll be back in Big Bend in September.
Okay. The reason I'm asking is we have several people in our group who are interested in doing night sky photography. And a few years ago, we went to the Jones Alta Vista Ranch for an overnight. It's south of Hebronville, and it's got very dark skies. I would say it's probably a Bortle 2. It's very remote. It's 34,000 acres. And the land across the road is 300,000 acres. So it's about half the size of Big Bend National Park, and it's all family owned.
Oh, wow.
To the north is Hebronville, 18 miles away. But other than Hebronville, there's not anything to the north.
Huh, okay.
So if people are interested in going to the Jones Alta Vista Ranch sometime during the summer, I know it's hot, but it's not like Big Bend. It's not that hot, but it is hot, but not as bad as Big Bend. Yeah. But if people are interested, we could set something up like that again. I know Vernon, you were there. Do you remember that?
I remember.
Yeah. And Antonio, were you there for that one?
I don't think so. We did night photography, but it was
at my house.
At your house, yeah.
Yeah, and I've got a decent dark sky, but not like the Jones Alta Vista Ranch. Yeah, Joanne Mitchell was there. I'm trying to think. It's been several years ago, but we had a lot of fun doing it. They've got a great big old red barn that when you're facing north, you're facing the front side of that barn. And so we did some painting with light. Um, we did a lot of different
Nice.
different kinds of shots. So I don't know if we would schedule something. We'd love to invite you to come down. I know it's not the same as the Northwest.
No, I'm happy to. Just let me know, and we can see if time will allow. Like I mentioned, I actually do work full time, so all the time that I spent leaving is vacation time. So I have to
Oh, okay.
really careful and allot my vacation time out. But yeah, I mean, especially if it's around a weekend, that helps. But
Yeah.
I would love to.
Okay, well, maybe we can have a separate conversation off of this Zoom program, and you and I can look at weekends and possibilities.
Sure, absolutely. I'm happy to do that.
Awesome. All right. Does anybody else have any questions for Shari? There should have been some generated.
I want to come.
Yay, Linda.
How are
Hi,
you?
Shari. You guys, I always interrupt your meetings, but I actually did a workshop with Shari, and she's a phenomenal teacher, and she's somebody you want to be next to in the dark because one, she knows the cameras, she knows what she's doing, and she makes you feel confident. And one of the last pictures she showed was Fort Griffin Historic Park. And I don't know if that was a different trip, Shari, but that was where we had our workshop. And it was just amazing to be with 8 other people. It was me, Shari, and 8 other women, and to hear people after their screen popped up. And it was just like these giggles and like, oh my gosh. And just, it was so exciting. And we're talking late into the night. She wouldn't do this to you guys, but we started shooting at 6:30 for sunset, 6:30 for sunset. We did not go to bed. We shot sunrise, and it was adrenaline the whole time. And it was a wonderful experience. So I'm just giving you a plug, Shari. So that's it. Okay. But I want to come down there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm happy to go. Yeah, definitely we can talk up screen. And, but that sounds exciting.
We would love to have you down. That would be even more special just because we've got you to ourselves. But I'm very excited about this. I am personally going to be teaching every Saturday in July, but it ends at 12:30 in the afternoon.
Okay.
So I could leave from the youth photo workshop in town and go out to the Jones Alta Vista. So we'll have to look at I guess the moon and other dates, times and dates and all that.
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, definitely contact me and we'll look at that.
Awesome. All right. Does anybody else have any questions?
Could you reiterate what that $10 item was that you said?
Yeah. So it's called Photo Pills.
Photo pills. Okay. All right.
Yeah, it's the best app I use for all planning. And
okay.
Even if I want to know, like real quickly, if I wanted to know in July, if I can shoot the Milky Way one night. So it may not be a new moon night, but it might be within a week of a new moon. And so even then, a Milky Way might be out at 10 or 11:30 and the moon doesn't rise till 1 a.m. So I know I've got 3 hours of Milky Way shooting I can do. So yeah, it's the best app. The augmented reality part, I can take my phone and kind of hold it up in front of the landscape of what I'm seeing. And then I can drag my finger across time on different days and know where and which direction the Milky Way is going to be. So it really helps with daytime planning and composition. I don't give enough speaking to daytime planning and scouting, which is really essential when you really start to, get better at Milky Way composition and photography. And it's so important to do a lot of daytime planning because you can't see anything at night, especially if you're in really, really dark areas. So that Photo Pills app is the best app to help plan.
right. Anybody else? No? I do have one announcement that doesn't have anything to do with this presentation, but we don't have any field trips planned yet, but as things are opening up here in Texas, we're starting to consider doing those things now. We aren't having our own meeting in June, but we have been asked by our older big sister, MONEP, Missouri Nature and Environmental Photographers, to join their meeting on June 15th. It's a Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock. It will be a Zoom meeting. Joe and Marianne McDonald are going to be the presenters, and it's a paid presentation, but MONEP is inviting us to be their guests gratis. So TexNEP members can join the June 15th meeting at 7 o'clock. We will send out an invitation as soon as we get all the details. But June 15th, 7 p.m., put that on your calendars. It will be a MONEP TexNEP dual meeting, I guess you would like to say. It's their meeting and we're the guests, but I'm really excited about it. Joe and Marianne are going to be talking about close-up photography, macro photography. They are experts at that, and pretty excited about that. All right. Does anybody have any further questions for Shari? This is your chance.
Just a comment. And I was very lucky to have a workshop at night with Ruth. It was great, and we had a lot of fun. But thank you very much, Mrs. Hunt. It has been a nice refresher. Like there was a lot that a couple of nights ago, and we're planning a camping trip. And so I was thinking, well, maybe we can do some night photography. And I was totally lost. Like I was looking for my notes, and Ruth, you know, she gave us notes, and you do your own notes in the corner and whatnot, and I couldn't find them. And so this was a great refresher. Really, really enjoyed it.
Good. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me, Ruth, and talking. It's great. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you as a guest here. I hope you'll consider coming back again.
Thank you very much. Have a nice one.
Thank you.
all for attending, and we'll be sending you an invitation to the June meeting.
Awesome.
Thank you.